Good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started if we can. So those of you coming in, if you just take your seats, please. Well, first of all, good evening to all of you. Welcome to what promises to be an interesting and timely debate on the situation in Egypt. As I'm sure you'll see, we have a very impressive lineup of speakers, two of whom will be joining us remotely. And time permitting, we will have questions at the end. What I would ask is, first of all, as a matter of housekeeping, if you could please turn all of your phones onto silent so as not to interrupt the proceedings. The event is being live streamed on Guernica's Facebook page and other platforms, and certainly there will be a final recording of the event. As I said, at the end of the session, if we have time, we will invite questions from the audience. What I would say is, and I will rigorously moderate that they are questions. Please refrain from giving any speeches or additional presentations yourselves, but if you have particular questions that you want to put to the panel members, then please feel free to do so. As many of you will know, Egypt has been a particular focus of the work of Guernica 37 for a number of years. We've prepared a number of reports on the deteriorating human rights situation in Egypt. We have represented pro bono journalists who were detained. We've taken cases to the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention, the Special Rapporteur on torture, and we continue to remain committed to defending human rights and democratic freedoms in Egypt, and as I say, we will continue to do so. I'm not going to be speaking very much this evening. This is quite unfamiliar territory for me to be relatively silent, but I do have a few remarks that I would like to make before I turn over to our panel. Each of our panel members will speak for approximately 7 minutes, and then, as I say, we'll have questions at the end. Before I start, or before we get started, I was considering carefully what I should say before we start. And rather than hear something that I believe, I want to quote from an Egyptian whose name is Sana Saif. Her brother is detained in an Egyptian prison, along with approximately 60,000 other detainees who are imprisoned for voicing their opposition to the current military regime. She stated publicly that the climate crisis is not about the planet. The planet will survive. The climate crisis is about life on the planet. And life in Egypt right now is, as we speak, very dangerous. Those were her words. She's been criticized by elements of those that support the military regime because they say that her brother's detention has nothing to do with climate change, and this is part of some liberal agenda. Climate change is very real and very dangerous for us all. What today is about, and what we must not allow, is for a dictatorship such as the military regime in Egypt, a regime that has one of the worst records of human rights protection, a regime that has decimated state institutions, including the judiciary, that now has no independence, a regime that has destroyed the very remnants of a democracy and installed an autocracy that tramples over basic rights. What we must not allow is for such a regime to wash away the memory of all of those who have suffered for a fraudulent attempt to convince the world that holding a global conference is a commitment to an honourable cause to save our very existence. Today and every day, think of the victims of the Egyptian regime, as we think about victims across the globe. Do not forget and do not tarnish their memories by greenwashing their suffering by standing next to an autocracy. So that's what I would like to say as an opening to what promises to be an important discussion. Our first speaker is Dr. Maha Azam, sitting to my right. Dr. Azam is chair of the Egyptians for Democracy and head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, a former fellow at Chatham House and the Royal Institute for International Affairs. She headed the Security and Development in Muslim States program at RUSI. Dr. Maha is going to be speaking about facing up to the human rights crisis in Egypt. I would like to turn over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby, and a big thank you to Guernica 37 for hosting this timely event. As we come up to the COP27 conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in a few days' time, I think it is pertinent that we gather here today in London to speak out about human rights. So many of us now, NGOs, activists, opposition groups opposed to the military dictatorship, people who actually even knew very little about Egypt, know that today Egypt is a country that survives under a dictatorship and has an abysmal human rights record. I won't go through the details of what Egyptians have faced since 2013 in terms of detention without trial, slow death in prison, torture, disappearances. This is the general human rights scene in Egypt over the last almost 1 decade now. What I will say is that the reports are clear, the reports of Amnesty International, of Human Rights Watch, who have worked relentlessly to show the world what is happening in Egypt, along with other NGOs, international and local. The situation in Egypt is such that civil society is stifled. It is stifled. Egypt is essentially what many describe as a republic of fear. In the last few days, Egyptians have been stopped on the street, they have been searched, their mobile phones have been searched, they live in a climate of fear. There have been arrests, even leading up to COP27. The regime is shameless in the way it treats its citizens and even guests of the country. Let me say this. The connection between climate justice and human rights is inextricably linked, and this has been voiced by so many. You cannot have mobilization in terms of the biggest threat that humanity faces today, and that is climate change and the environment, without an open society, without a civil society, without freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. You can't have bloggers being detained for years, journalists being detained for years. You need a vibrant civil society in order to hold government accountable, whether in Egypt or elsewhere. It is civil society, it is ordinary people, it is the justice system, it is a free press, it is free groups, women's groups, students' groups, environmental groups that will hold government accountable as to what is happening with the environment, climate change, and so on. Egypt itself, under Sisi, has not abstained from doing a great deal of damage to the environment, whether in building the new administrative city that uses enormous amounts of water in order to fulfill the dreams of a military elite to have buildings with swimming pools, whether it is the culling and cutting down of trees and gardens in Cairo and Alexandria, whether it's the military-run factories of cement and fertilizers. Egypt also, let us remember, is the largest non-OPEC producer of oil in Africa and the second largest producer of gas in Africa, and therefore there needs to be accountability as regards the exploration done by oil companies. Who is going to hold General Sisi to account? It's not just the international system, it should be the Egyptian people. And for the Egyptian people to live in an environment that is healthy, an environment that plays its role in saving humanity, it needs to be free. It needs to have its rights respected. And therefore, civil society, an open civil society, is crucial. Western governments, democratic governments like the United Kingdom and the United States, and we've heard that, that Britain and Rishi Sunak will be attending the COP conference, that Biden will be there, that the French president will be there. All these people are going to Egypt, and they have very close bilateral relations with the Egyptian general. And we know full well that whenever we speak to policymakers, they say to us, we don't miss an occasion without mentioning human rights. They may not miss an occasion without mentioning human rights, but the reality is that there are over 60,000 political prisoners, and very little or nothing has been done to ensure that the Egyptian people are not detained, that they do not have their rights disrespected, that they do not die in prison because they have had to go on hunger strike or they've been denied medication. Ultimately, democracies have maybe whispered in the general's ear privately, but they have done very little or nothing at all to change the situation. And therefore today, and during COP, the next 2 weeks, and after COP, we must ensure that the cause of the Egyptian people is not forgotten, and that civil society in the West continues to speak out. This is crucial, not only in terms of the rights of Egyptians, but it is vital in terms of climate justice for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maha. Before we go on to the next speaker, and this is a lesson in paying close attention to the agenda, there will now be a promotional, well, a video, a short 2-minute video played before we go on to the next speaker. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Paul Reynolds, who is an independent advisor on international relations, economics and senior governance, and is the author of a forthcoming book on improving public policy making. Professor Reynolds is going to be speaking about Egypt, industrial structure, and its impact on politics, human rights, and the environment. Professor Reynolds.
Good evening. Nice to see everyone here, and I hope everyone is relatively well. I'm going to talk about the political and environmental impact of industrial structure in Egypt, and drift into some quite controversial and difficult topics. As many people in this room are aware, the Egyptian economy is dominated by military enterprises, and indeed it was military enterprises played a major role in the state, even before the 2013-2014 coup, although under international cover from the GCC, US, UK, France and other countries, he has extended the tentacles of military enterprises across the country. And what I want to say about this is, look, if you look at cases like, look at Tunisia to some extent, Sudan, Algeria, Zimbabwe, and even Myanmar, there are lots of places around the world where the military have a big role in the economy, owning state enterprises of one sort or another, and it has a major impact on the politics of those countries. The difficulty is, for example, if you have an uprising, 2011 across the Middle East, or you have the uprising in Sudan, Algeria, then you may have some interregnum of at least a hope of progress, but then shortly after there's another coup and the people that own the economy are back in some way or other. They find their way back, and this is something which has to be addressed if human rights are to be improved. And of course one has to be difficult, because how you describe the problem leads people to determine what the solution is. So one has to be careful in defining the problem as entirely to do with industrial structure, but the impunity which it provides across the country is the power from which human rights abuses and environmental degradation come. It's the impunity in both financial and environmental in the military enterprises which is at the root of the perpetuation under international cover of hegemonic dictatorship. It is often said that, oh, well, you know, military enterprises, it's only, you know, less than a third of the economy. That may well be kind of statistically, technically correct, but it's not the reality, because it's not just the ownership of enterprises, it's also the placement of military officers and retired officers to both state and private companies across the economy. It's the extraction of rents through licensing and permissions. You can't do anything with land in Egypt without the permission of the military, and the military, especially as it's accelerated under Sisi, which is that they are gaining more and more and more land which they own, and they may even have an industrial zone which covers the entire Mediterranean coast at some point. They are building roads and then commandeering the territory all around the roads in order to make profit. Let us not forget, this is a country in which the military have a monopoly on school meals. I mean, this is more than just a third of the economy in practice. I mean, you can't move without military permission. And it means, I mean, you think of particular cases where, I mean, there's a famous dairy company in Egypt where the military decided it wanted to take it over and own it, and as you can well imagine, the owners objected, ended up beaten up and in prison, and the son of the owner ended up beaten up in prison as well. So these sprawling tentacles create a situation where, I mean, even if there was a kind of overnight revolution, inshallah, you know, in Egypt tomorrow, they'd all be back pretty quickly in some way or other, because they have a grip of the economy. The result is that Egypt has become a very high risk for international investment. Few, apart from behind closed doors investments from GCC countries, few investments occur. Of course, the British have BP with the help from senior officials in the UK security institutions. But generally speaking, you don't get international investment flowing into the country. This creates a major difficulty in terms of risk. One mustn't forget that in Egypt there are more people under age 9 than there are over 40. And the economy is not capable of developing sufficient opportunities for the people coming into the workforce. So things augur very badly indeed. The final thing I would say is, we can talk more about this later, but the final thing I would say is Egypt is heavily dependent upon the International Monetary Fund for its survival. And it is reported in the press that they've just agreed a new financing from the IMF. This is actually not true. It hasn't been, the deal hasn't been signed because there's an obstacle. The obstacle is that the IMF require the government to have military enterprises under normal commercial law, and the military are refusing, and Sisi has been threatened so that he's rather blocked for that. So things look even more bleak. Egypt, even though the economy is rather small, it's the second largest borrower of funds from the IMF on this planet. So there's a heavy dependence there. And now we're at the stage where they've got to breach their opaque military enterprise system in order to meet the requirements of the IMF to obtain the funding. So it all looks extremely bleak, and I certainly wouldn't put my money in Egypt. I'm sure you wouldn't either. We'll discuss these things a little bit more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reynolds. We're going to turn to the next speaker now, to my left, Bill Law. Bill is a Sony award-winning journalist and editor of the Arab Digest. He is the founder of The Gulf Matters, providing analysis and journalism focusing on the Gulf states. Bill is going to be discussing the battle for human rights is inextricably woven into the battle to save the Earth's environment. Bill.
Thank you, Toby, and thanks for the invitation to be here, and thank you all for coming. I wrote a piece last week for Arab Digest about Qatar and the World Cup, and how the Qataris have left themselves open to criticism by carrying out reforms for migrant workers far too slowly. But it is fact that Qatar has carried out reforms, not enough, too slowly certainly, but by Gulf standards, a significant step in the right direction, which I acknowledged in my article. There is still much to criticize, of course. LGBTQ rights is another area of concern. But it did strike me that the volume of attacks aimed at Qatar ahead of a major event, the World Cup, is the equivalent of a large wave. That's certainly how the Qataris are experiencing it. And then I consider another major global event, COP27, and I see almost no criticism of a regime with one of the most despicable human rights records in the world. There is a trickle of criticism where there should be a tsunami of criticism of Sisi's Orwellian Egypt. It is a country where, as Dr. Maha said, tens of thousands of prisoners of conscience are jailed in the most appalling and awful conditions, where journalists are routinely harassed and detained, where criticism of the regime is viciously and ferociously repressed, where the only democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, spent 6 years in solitary confinement, forced to sleep on a concrete floor, denied medicines and treatment for diabetes and high blood pressure, and his death in June 2019 in a Cairo courtroom was effectively a state-sanctioned arbitrary killing. Human rights, free speech, free media, free assembly, the rights to organize are supposed to be the bedrock of our liberal democracy. There are other rights, the right to food security, to clean air, to clean water. The link between these rights and human rights is clear to me. They are intertwined. I was dismayed when our Prime Minister said he was not going to turn up to Sharm el-Sheikh. Well, we found out today he's decided to come for a day, and I think Boris Johnson announcing he would be showing up at Sharm may have had something to do with the latest U-turn from our government of U-turns. But we can be assured that Rishi Sunak will not raise any issues about the extreme abuse the Sisi regime is carrying out on the Egyptian people. Not the appropriate forum, he would say, if pressed. Really? I wrote a piece some years ago about the destruction of human rights in Bahrain and the silencing of the free media there. And I began it with this. My 17-year-old daughter discovered a series of photographs from the 1960s American civil liberties struggle that shows groups of African-American men in Memphis, Tennessee, carrying signs that simply say, "I am a man." They were published in newspapers of the day, and the stark simplicity of the words, the mute power of the images helped to turn the tide in a battle that many had judged could not be won. My daughter incorporated those photographs into an art project that explores giving voice to the victims of human rights abuses. As she continued her research, she came across the story of Eric Garner, the 43-year-old who, whilst in a chokehold applied by a New York City police officer, repeatedly gasped out, "I can't breathe," just before he died. I told her of how Bahraini friends and colleagues had used that identical phrase to describe what was happening to them. The chokehold was not a sole police officer, it was the full array of the state, squeezing out of them the right to speak and write openly and freely. The links between the struggle for civil liberties, challenging state oppression, and a free and open press is as clear now in Bahrain as it was more than 50 years ago in Memphis, Tennessee. A free press is the lungs of a free society. And when the lungs are assailed by draconian laws, near daily harassment, assaults on the street and in detention, unfair trials and imprisonment, it is not only the journalists and their families who suffer, it is the whole society. Well, that's what I wrote then. And then I was reminded that the rainforests of the Amazon have been described as the lungs of the world, ravaged under the rule of Bolsonaro, so let's hope that Lula can bring those lungs back to health. The destruction of those forests affects us all, just as the destruction of human rights, whenever and wherever it happens, and it's happening all over the world, affects all of us. Our leaders will go to Sharm el-Sheikh to discuss important plans to try and save the world from a looming environmental disaster, and hopefully they'll come up with some solutions. But they will have their conversations without making the connection between the environment and the human rights disaster that is unfolding in Egypt, in the wider Middle East and North Africa, in China, in Russia, and yes, right here in the UK, where we have a Home Secretary who dog whistles about an invasion of migrants and her dream, her obsession to put them on a plane to Rwanda. So I'll end by saying that human rights are an environmental issue. By our leaders and our media, and yes, ourselves as individuals, failing to fight for human rights in Egypt in the run-up to COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh, we deliver an easy win to authoritarians and vicious dictators like Sisi, who have no regard for the environment, just as they have no regard for the human rights of the people they so brutally rule over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Our next speaker is Peter Oborn, who's going to be appearing remotely. Peter is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and author of The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam. He is the former political commentator of Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, and The Daily Mail. Peter is going to be talking about global warming and climate change deserve our attention, so does Egypt's human rights abuses. Before I turn over to Peter, as he's appearing remotely and will not be able to take any questions at the end, I just want to put a question for you to consider during your time with us. And that's something that you've spoken about before, but what is our government doing and what should they be doing? Peter.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
That's fantastic, and I really apologise. I can't make it tonight at this enormously important event. Well, I've written very extensively about the pathetic and shameful performance of the British government in connection with what is going on in Egypt. Our sort of we didn't notice, as the nicest way of putting it, that Egypt ceased to be a democratic government and became a dictatorship. We never condemned the coup d'etat. We resumed arms sales to the Sisi regime very shortly after the coup d'etat. We've never used the term coup d'etat about what happened in Egypt, and we've been completely pathetic about protesting against the kind of desperate conditions in Egyptian jails and the 60,000 political prisoners. Do you want me to go on about the wretched performance of successive Conservative governments here in Britain?
Well, I think it's something that we've come to expect, Peter. So please.
Yeah. Well, what I on the other hand, I am a great supporter of COP27. I think it's a fantastic thing. I do wish that our king had been allowed to go. I welcome the fact our Prime Minister has changed his mind, but he continues to block the presence of of the king, and I want to make a few remarks about other people who won't be able to attend, apart from King Charles or the King of the United Kingdom. And that, of course, is all the people who are locked up in jails. And on that basis, I think I want to make an appeal to the delegates who will be attending the event in Sharm el-Sheikh. Actually, rather than do that in my words, while I was researching tonight's event, I discovered a remarkable article by Yaha, I apologize to him if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, Yaha Ahmed, who was as you will know, a minister in the Morsi government in Middle East Eye, which I write for. And it's very, very powerful what he has to say. That, he's, as previous speakers have noticed, even environmental and human rights NGOs are facing severe crackdowns now. But he makes this point: the fight against climate change cannot succeed without total respect for human rights. He then addresses the delegates. I imagine many of you have encountered a moral dilemma about whether to participate in this mega PR operation for a criminal state, or whether to forfeit any influence over COP27 decisions at a time of acute climate crisis. And then he goes on to make a suggestion about how to resolve this dilemma. Say their names. Speak the names of the 60,000 political prisoners and all the muzzled activists prevented from working alongside you at COP27. Yes, you may be participating in a greenwashing operation, but you have the power to tarnish it by becoming an advocate for those you are missing. And then he makes this crucial point. Unlike Egyptian activists, you will be safe if you ask sensitive questions. Unlike the tens of thousands of political prisoners locked up in Sisi's jails, or former prisoners subject to travel bans, you will be able to walk free within and from Egypt, even if you broach difficult subjects. So there you have it. It's perfectly possible to combine COP27 with powerful statements which will really hit home in this environment about the wretched situation currently prevailing in Egypt. He went to go in this article, which I do recommend. He goes on to mention and detail the circumstances of many of the people in Egyptian jails at the moment. I just want to say that I do apologize again for not being here tonight, but it's so important that we do make this statement ahead of COP27, and thank you very much for doing this.
I just want to check whether we still have Peter on the line, because he's disappeared.
I'm here.
Yeah. So, Peter, as you have to go shortly, I just want to see if I can take two questions from the audience before you depart. If anybody wants to put a question to Peter now, as he won't be here at the end of the session. Well, Peter, it seems that your presentation was so overwhelming.
Yes, it was. Anyway, thank you very much, and I apologize again. And think that Prince King Charles of England is in the same position as the 60,000 political prisoners. He's banned from attending COP27.
Well, once again, Peter, thank you very much for making the effort. We really do appreciate you participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to turn now to our next speaker to my far right, Zamzam Ibrahim. She's a climate justice activist, a co-founder of Students Organising for Sustainability UK and the former national president of the National Union of Students in the United Kingdom. Zamzam is going to be speaking today about the role of the youth in tackling climate change and human rights.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to say that I've never been referred to being on the far right, so it just threw me off a little bit. But thank you very much, and thank you for the organisers for putting this together and also inviting me to this space. And quite honoured actually to be one of the only young climate activists on this space that actually has participated in COP. And until actually 2 days ago, was supposed to be participating physically at COP27. But actually, let me use this opportunity to kind of draw back and explain why climate justice is intrinsically linked to the human rights issue. And arguably is probably the biggest human rights issue in human history. We've all heard multiple times, multiple quotes, multiple people talk about it in the space of those that impact the climate the least are the ones that are suffering the most, right? We've all heard that, I assume. And that couldn't be more true. But actually, let's understand why that is and why do we speak about the climate crisis under very specific lenses, right? And often when the climate change is presented to us, the narrative that's used is the numbers. We're talking about the technical stuff, the data science behind the impacts. And what that's essentially doing is it's depoliticizing the climate crisis in itself, right? And it's dehumanizing the experiences of the impact the climate crisis is having, right? And so therefore we're talking about the numbers that's being impacted, but not actually about the lives that are lost and the people that are impacted. And so what is very, climate change is deeply political. And it is true to say that it's impacting people of colour disproportionately than it is anywhere else. So understanding actually it's these systemic hierarchies that are created as part of that: race, gender, class, citizenship, to the point where people have become individualized, right? And we become divided from one another. And a great example of that I enjoy giving to people is people don't have to realize that the concept of the carbon footprint was coined by the big oil companies, BP, Shell, right? They're the ones that coined that. And they coined that to ensure that we as individuals take responsibility, right? And for their essential corporate greed that's costing the planet. So now, flip this in the context of COP, right? Understanding that like this COP, and why does it link essentially to this human rights violations? I think it's really important to understand that like as activists ourselves, as young climate activists, for years we've been shouting from every platform we ever get given that the global south is never a part of the conversation. We've been shouting from every rooftop that Africa is impacted in ways that it never has before. We've been shouting about the fact that Africa is consistently not being given the climate finance that it needs to succeed, right? We know about the floods in Nigeria, we know about the droughts in Somalia. And so understanding that context, first of all, and the global north's failure to meet the climate financing that it agreed to. So if you're aware, there was an agreement that to reach the 100 billion fund. I don't think they reached 10% of that, and even the 10% that they did reach came in the form of debt. But what's happening now is Egypt is purposely using a PR stunt to place itself as the African COP. It's speaking as if it's the global south. So the efforts of us as young activists and campaigners who have been talking about the global south not being listening, Egypt is now used that as a vehicle to say that they will lobby for and fight on the vision of loss and damage, right? And it's a brilliant PR tool if you think about it, right? And that's exactly what they're doing. And through that, they're getting away with, I mean, of course, I don't need to list, and other speakers have already, I don't need to list the things that the Sisi authoritarian regime has done since coming into its position, but also in the violations of environmental issues that it's caused. I think it goes without saying the mass urbanization, the lack of the increase of gas and oil exportation and importation. So that doesn't even necessarily even need to be linked by me. So this COP is, and I think actually contextually understanding that all COPs have been very much greenwashing conferences, right? They're literally a corporate smoke show. I was at COP26, and it was genuinely just a bunch of corporations that poured money into it, and it was just glitz and glam, and it was completely different from what it was in the inside to the outside. But this COP is specifically different. It's not even greenwashing. It's whitewashing on a mass scale. And I think that's really important to understand, because what's happening right now is Egypt is quite literally and quite blatantly putting a middle finger up on the world stage to the concept of justice in itself. And I think that's very dangerous, because all of these environmental organizations, our country nations and our delegations that are going to these spaces, not a single one has actually coherently and confidently held Sisi's regime accountable. And there's a lack of accountability from essentially a space that is supposed to come together to build a just and sustainable world. So I think it's really important to recognize that. And one of the things that I did want to recognize that even though I'm not an expert on the human rights violations of Egypt, I do remember 2013, the Rabba massacre, and I do remember a dear friend of mine being arrested, Ibrahim Halawa, a good friend of mine now. But I do also remember that in 2015, one of the first things that I was involved with in terms of the student movement was mass organizing and campaigning and learning about Ibrahim's story. And that's the first time I understood the power, actually, of international solidarity and leveraging power and coordinating mass international pressure. And I think that's a very vital and important role that we all play in ensuring that the 60,000 political prisoners that sit in jails right now as we speak in this space, and as Monday the conference commences and starts in Egypt, we have a huge part to play in ensuring that we bring that to light, and like the previous speaker said, by one of the authors who wrote that, is actually one of the important things is to say their names and consistently repeat the atrocities that are happening, regardless of what we're talking about, whether we're talking about biodiversity or whether we're talking about climate financing, actually to consistently talk about and bring that specific issues into the conversation. And I think I'm going to leave it there before I keep going on, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zamzam, and I'm sure we'll come back to you with questions at the end. We're turning now to our second speaker who's appearing remotely, and that's Joe Stork. Joe is an American political activist and Deputy Director for Middle East and North Africa at Human Rights Watch. His current work focuses on violations of international human rights and humanitarian law by states and armed groups. And this evening he's going to be talking about protecting the environment goes hand in hand with protecting people's freedoms. Joe, thank you very much for joining us. And as you are appearing remotely, I understand that you'll be happy to take questions at the end if there are questions. So audience members, please feel free to ask questions at the end. Joe, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks to Gornick and 37 for convening this evening's discussion and for inviting me to participate. I think the first point to make, of course, is that the climate crisis is very much a human rights crisis in itself. We can see that from the mounting toll it's taking on lives and livelihoods, and we can see it especially in the way that it aggravates existing inequities and inequalities. You've already heard from a number of preceding speakers about the specific human rights violations that Egypt is noted for, that President Sisi is noted for. What are the specific restrictions, the specific violations that pertain to this COPS conference? I would say the very core political right of free expression and free, peaceful assembly. We see this in the way the Egyptian government has tried to restrict and segregate participants in the particularly climate activist organizations and human rights activist organizations to a corner of Sharm el-Sheikh, well away from the conference proceedings, a part of an area, essentially a cage, in effect a cage that's going to be open from 10 in the morning till 5 p.m. in the evening, strictly monitored. We're talking about, fortunately, I'm glad to say, many of the climate activist groups that we've been in touch with, like the Egyptian groups, are refusing to go along with it, refusing to confine themselves or to participate in this kind of circus of restricting their activities to this area. Even in this area, you have to give 48 hours notice. You have to provide contact information for those who are going to be there and so forth. It's really quite a mockery. I think the other concern we have, a major concern, is the issue of reprisals. This is something we see constantly in Egypt, and many of the people who were arrested, who are put in front of so-called terrorism courts and military courts, sentenced to long prison terms, like Abdel Fattah, are there on the basis of reprisals for their attempts to exercise freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful assembly. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if, for instance, some Egyptian activists, or for that matter, other activists who are in Egypt for COPs, speak out critically about the Egyptian government. Perhaps they won't be picked up right away. They won't be picked up until all the dignitaries and presidents and prime ministers and so forth have left Sharm el-Sheikh, but they will be picked up. They will be brought in essentially enforced disappearances, quite typical in Egypt. We know that, for instance, the taxi cabs in Sharm el-Sheikh have had cameras installed to monitor all visual and audio activity. These cameras are linked to Interior Ministry operations rooms. And this is clearly going to be a highly surveilled and supervised operation. I also want, though, to point out that COPS, in some respects, represents an opportunity for human rights. And here maybe I'll disagree a little bit with my good friend Bill Law. I mean, we may not have seen the kind of wave of attention that Qatar is getting where it's hosting the World Cup. But we are certainly seeing much more attention to Egypt than we usually see, at least in the media and in the terms of the awareness of the groups working on climate, on environmental issues. Is quite significant, I think. The fact that these groups have been put in touch with their Egyptian colleague organizations, the fact that with the Egyptian organizations, they're refusing to participate in the circus that the government is trying to arrange for them. So I think I wouldn't discount at all the extent to which this is an opportunity. We've seen an acceleration in the release of political prisoners. This is no small thing. It may be small in terms of the numbers of prisoners who are still in jail, okay, for sure. But for those people who have been able to get out and be with their families again, it's certainly no small thing. I think the fact that you're here with us this evening means you're certainly well acquainted with human rights violations in Egypt. I want to specifically talk, perhaps in my last remarks, about why environmental research in particular is so difficult in Egypt. There are Egyptian organizations have been working on climate issues. The fact is, it's a very sensitive issue. As previous speakers have pointed out, a very significant segment of the economy is controlled by the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military, some of these activities, like water bottling, like cement factories, like quarrying and so forth, where the military is very heavily invested, are also those kinds of places, those kinds of activities, those industries that are particularly serious polluters or dealing with helping to create scarcities. So I think that's, of course, only one reason why the government is so sensitive and putting up such barriers as it has put up to the work of environmental groups. The law in Egypt prevents groups from working on anything considered political. But of course, the term political is completely undefined, left purposely vague, and we see the results in the kinds of people, the kinds of arrests that are routinely made. Egypt's climate record itself is certainly nothing to brag about, and it can't be that it got the nod to host the COP's conference on the basis of its own environmental record. One of the issues in Egypt is lack of freedom of information. So journalists, advocates for human rights, for environmental rights, are prevented from researching, and when they do research, are prevented from publishing work on these issues in Egypt. What should the Egyptian government do about this? Well, of course, what we want to see is easing their grip on civic space. So far, we've seen just the opposite. What should this mean for the people attending, particularly heads of state? And I think it would be a shame, a real shame, if Prime Minister Sunak, if President Biden, if the other dignitaries attending, even if it's only for one day, did not make their attendance somehow conditional on releasing even more political prisoners, including the highest profile political prisoners like Alaa Abdel Fattah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask members of the audience if they have any questions they'd like to put to you now. So, can you take the microphone, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Joe. My name is Irina van Wiesa. I'm a former vice chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee in the European Parliament. And I just wanted to firstly thank Human Rights Watch and other organizations for speaking up for Egypt. I do think that it does work. By the way, and also to respond to Bill, I believe it's today that the Human Rights Committee in the European Parliament, of which we are very sadly not a part anymore since Brexit, but they are discussing human rights issues in Egypt in the run-up to COP27, I believe, tonight. So it is on the radar screen. And we have seen that international coordinated pressure does work. When I was at the European Parliament, for example, it was just a time when a human rights defender in Egypt, Ibrahim Ezeldin, was disappeared. And it was through concerted efforts of Human Rights Watch and other organizations and the European Parliament and constant public reminders that after 300 days in prison, Ibrahim was freed. So I believe it does work. And Egypt is not China. Egypt needs us. Egypt needs the rest of the world, and particularly the large economies, urgently. So pressure does work, and I think the pressure has to be kept up. So I agree with you, Joe. I think this opportunity should be used to keep up the pressure, but also to make a lot of those bilateral and multilateral agreements with Egypt dependent on human rights conditionality as well as environmental rights conditionality. Thank you.
Can I ask if there are any other questions? Well, Joe, perhaps I can put a couple of points to you. One of the earlier speakers said that there have been comments made that this is not the correct forum to be raising human rights. I think from your presentation, you clearly see that this is the correct forum, and this is an opportunity. I suppose the question is, if this isn't the correct forum, then when is?
Well, I think it's kind of ridiculous, don't you think, to be speaking about, is there a correct forum? Or is such and such an assembly, a venue, not correct to raise human rights issues? It's hard to think of one where it would be incorrect to raise human rights issues. And so, as I said, as other speakers have said, there's a connectivity, an interface between human rights issues and climate justice issues that simply can't be denied. The fact is that the Egyptian government, I think perhaps, I wonder if it may have a few regrets about having been designated the host of COPs, precisely because of the attention it's gotten. I agree with Bill that the attention, I would agree with Bill that the attention has been mainly in the media, but that's very significant, I think. What's missing, though, as far as we can tell, is attention, voluble attention, public remarks from officials here in Washington, officials in London, in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, etc. This is what's needed. So the work ahead of us is not only in Sharm el-Sheikh. That's going to be over in a week or two. But this is a job, this is work that has to go on continuously in the capitals where many of us live and work. Thanks.
Joe, thank you very much for that. And just to say also, I completely agree and I share your sorrow in us having exited the EU. But I still believe that the power of the European Parliament is very evident in Egypt as well as other situations. And Joe, can I just commend you and Human Rights Watch for its continued commitment to not just Egypt, but these conflicts all over the world. I think the work you do is incredibly important, and so I think we all salute the work you do. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I do want to take this opportunity to say the work we do has its impact because of the work we do in conjunction with Amnesty International, and in the case of Egypt, with so many Egyptian activists and groups on the ground who are, of course, the ones who are really in the firing line. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. So I'd like to turn to our next speaker, Amelia Smith. She's a writer and journalist focusing on Egypt, having lived there for a number of years. She's the editor of 2 books, The Arab Spring, 5 Years On, and A Chronicle of Adventure and Fraud Under the Egyptian Blockade. Tonight she's going to be speaking about human rights abuses in North Sinai and environmental issues in South Sinai. Amelia.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'd like you to imagine for a few minutes that you're at home with your family, 5 kids, cooking, watching TV, having a nice evening together, and suddenly you hear a bang on the door. You go to answer it, but before you can even answer it, Egyptian security forces burst through, arrest your husband, and then come back a day later and arrest your 14-year-old son. This is Arish, it's the capital of North Sinai, and it's a story recounted to me 4 years ago by a woman who lives there, Ibrahim, who has since found out that her husband has been tortured to death. And when I spoke to her again last week, she still has no idea where her son, who is now 18, is. So this is a devastating story, but unfortunately it's not an isolated incident. It's one example of many severe human rights abuses that are taking place in North Sinai, on the same peninsula where COP will be held on Sunday. Yet, despite it being in the same part of Egypt, North Sinai rarely makes the news because the government has placed a very strong media blackout on the area. Yet, in the name of the war on terror, since 2013, the Egyptian military has destroyed thousands of homes. It's forcibly evicted thousands of people from these homes. It's razed farmland to the ground, it's extrajudicially killed unarmed civilians, and children like Ibrahim have been tortured, they have been forcibly disappeared, and some of them are still in prison. And the question people in Sinai are asking is, will cases like Ibrahim's be raised at COP? And will human rights abuses in Egypt, as we've discussed a lot this evening, let alone North Sinai, even be on the agenda? So, like its human rights record in Sinai, Egypt is trying to conceal its environmental record. But as COP approaches, more and more people are talking about Egypt's environmental record, in particular the erasure of green spaces or the massacre of trees, as people have referred to it, and the building of highways through historic neighborhoods to make way for government mega projects. And South Sinai has not escaped this. Local residents have told me in particular they're very concerned about the fate of St. Catherine's Protectorate, which is an Egyptian national park in Sinai where the World Heritage Site, St. Catherine's Monastery, and Mount Sinai is, which is where Moses is said to have received the Ten Commandments. So Sinai, or in particular this part of Sinai, is famous for its dramatic mountain range and its Bedouin population, many of whom act as mountain guides and take people to the top of Mount Sinai. And in general, St. Catherine's is a peaceful place, and it draws a very different type of tourist than someone who would go to Sharm el-Sheikh, who would go perhaps for the development or the nightlife. However, this is all about to change because the government is building a mega tourism project called the Grand Transfiguration Project in St. Catherine's Protectorate. And when it's finished, it will include something like 5 hotels, a theatre, a youth centre. And what you'll effectively have is the Bedouin women tending to their goats, making fires, making tea, looking out onto very high-class villas for very wealthy tourists, and wondering whether any of the tourism revenue from this will trickle down to them. Many Bedouins in Sinai are marginalized. The first stage of this Grand Transfiguration project has cost £175 million. People are asking, why has this money gone into yet another government project rather than into investing in infrastructure or schools or hospitals, which the region desperately needs? The development is threatening rare wildlife. It's completely altered the landscape. It's completely scarred the village. The government has cut down trees, it's demolished gardens, it's completely destroyed a cemetery and people's houses just to make way for this project. And people are also asking, where is the water coming from? There's a severe shortage of water in parts of Egypt, but particularly in Sinai. In St. Catherine's, people rely on rain and snow water to irrigate their gardens, to wash, to drink. And you have now a wealthy, huge villas. Everyone will need water. And the government has built a huge artificial lake in front of it, which they will have to fill. So all of this is taking place. This is just 50 miles from where COP27 will take place on Sunday. And there is a delegation from the conference centre scheduled to visit St. Catherine's, yet human rights groups have said there's no evidence that there are representatives of Sinai residents and Bedouins have been invited to participate in the conference in a meaningful way. And on the list of NGOs attending the conference, there are no Egyptian NGOs based in Sinai or focused on Sinai attending. So the delegation, when they do arrive at St. Catherine's from Sharm el-Sheikh, are unlikely to be told exactly what's going on in St. Catherine's. And as one resident told me, if climate activists saw what was really happening in Sinai, they would either laugh or have a heart attack. It's not coherent with any kind of policy, and it's not at all preserving the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for that. I'd like to turn to our final speaker, Philip Luther. Philip is the Research and Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa for Amnesty UK. He has extensive expertise in human rights policy analysis, international relations, Middle East and North Africa. Philip is also due to travel to Cairo. I hope sitting on this panel and what he has to say won't impact on the Egyptian government granting him a visa, and that he is able to go and raise these important issues which Amnesty has been a powerful voice in consistently raising, and we're very grateful to have Philip with us this evening.
Yes, I hope so. Thanks very much indeed, Toby, and thanks to the Guernica 37 chambers in general for this invitation to speak. I mean, it's an incredibly timely event, and really great to see so many people here. Thanks for coming. It's difficult to go last because particularly there's a big panel and so many important points have already been made. So I've been scribbling away just to try and ensure I complement rather than overly repeating and duplicating what you've already heard. From Amnesty International's perspective, and we've been repeatedly on the public record on this, as have, of course, Egyptian human rights activists and, as Joe mentioned earlier, Human Rights Watch and other international organizations. COP27 is taking place against the backdrop of stifling of civil society and severe repression of dissent. And adding to what we've heard already, what have we seen in the lead up to COP27? Well, there have been a number of things that we mentioned, but as well, the Egyptian authorities have excluded the independent Egyptian human rights NGOs from accreditation. So they did a one-off accreditation process. It was extended, and they would say, well, we've extended it to civil society organizations. It was extended only to non-critical civil society organizations, and so the independent ones were left out. And it's the directors and staff of those very organizations who've not been given accreditations that, of course, have been under attack, as we've just heard, since 2014, through politically motivated criminal prosecutions, imprisonment, arbitrary travel bans, and the like. Not only that, and this is why we've got to be vigilant after COP, there's a sort of Damocles hanging over many of them, in that they've issued an ultimatum, the authorities have issued an ultimatum to those independent human rights organizations to effectively re-register by April next year under a new repressive NGO law issued in 2019, or face closure. So there's a real threat that it's not just them being harassed, but the organizations not being able to exist anymore. It's an existential threat. We've heard as well the Egyptian authorities have been trying to clean up their image, and obviously that's partly linked to the increased scrutiny around COP and the lead up to it. It's also linked, I think it's fair to say, to growing international criticism. Admittedly is a trickle, but, and adding to the point about European institutions, we did see, which doesn't happen often, a joint statement issued last year by 32 UN member states at the UN Human Rights Council. Now, that limited pressure has arguably had some impact. Now, the Egyptian authorities would point to the fact that in October last year, they lifted the state of emergency. That had been operating off and on, but mainly on for 4 decades. There was the reactivation of the Presidential Pardons Committee in April of this year. And as we've heard, a number of high-profile activists, hundreds of others held for political reasons, have been released. That's good news, but closer inspection reveals a far less luminous story. I mean, what you see is, take the state of emergency. That was lifted. What happened afterwards? The Egyptian authorities immediately adopted several laws that brought back exactly the sort of measures the lifting of a state of emergency should be expected to remove. Entrenching the president's exceptional powers, expanding the jurisdiction of military courts over civilians, and restricting freedom of expression and access to information. So, as an example, it was made a criminal offense to collect unauthorized information on the Egyptian military's activities, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. And as we've been hearing, this is in a context where the military has huge and opaque business activities. It's not just about it being a military force. And these have had, of course, major environmental impacts. Not only that, the authorities immediately before the lifting of the state of emergency referred dozens of people, human rights defenders, activists, opposition politicians, to trials by inherently unfair emergency courts whose verdicts cannot be appealed. and some of those are ongoing over a year afterwards. In other cases, individuals have been convicted to long prison sentences or the death penalty in grossly unfair proceedings. And despite the hundreds who've been released, which of course is as Joe mentioned, is incredibly important for them and their families, thousands, of course, remain arbitrarily detained. And now, what our research has been showing over the last few months is that we've recorded that the rate of arrests of critics or perceived critics and opponents has continued at nearly double the rate of those releases. So that gives you a sense of what's been happening. We've recorded over 1,500 new politically motivated arrests in the last 6 months alone. So there's a bit of smoke and mirrors going on here. Now, as I mentioned, those arrests and harassment continue, and in some cases directly linked to COP. So what our research shows that over 90 individuals have been arrested in connection with calls for protests on the 11th of November during COP. And as with patterns with past planned protests, security forces have intensified random police checks in major town squares and have been unlawfully checking phones for critical content. I think the names you mentioned, but of course among those detained is Egyptian-British blogger Ali Abdel Fattah. He's spent most of the past decade behind bars. And he was one of those dozens of individuals who, just before the state of emergency was lifted, was rushed to trial before an emergency court. And like so many others, sentenced at the end of last year to broadcasting false news. And that is a classic common charge that's used to criminalize peaceful criticism of the authorities. And his life's in danger, since 1st of November, he's been refraining from even the mere 100 calories he'd been consuming on a daily basis since April to pressure Egypt to allow him access to British consular services. And he's announced his intention to stop drinking water from the 6th of November when COP starts. So many, of course, in Egypt and beyond have been campaigning for the UK authorities to press Egyptian counterparts for his immediate release before it's too late. And finally, more broadly, Amnesty and, of course, a whole range of other organizations have been endorsing a petition that, led by 12 Egyptian human rights NGOs in the context of COP, the call on the Egyptian president to release all those arbitrarily detained, to open civic space, to allow peaceful protests. At the end of the day, what we have to do is continue to press the Egyptian authorities and those who have influence over them to say that climate justice cannot be achieved without a vibrant, free civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. I'd like to now open the opportunity for any final questions from members of the audience.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you everyone for your contribution. The question is, we have been spending a lot of time talking about human rights, and without linking human rights to political change. So let us assume that the military regime in Egypt releases all the prisoners today. Will he not re-arrest them tomorrow if the same regime, the same mentality remains? And the overriding question is, can human rights be protected under dictatorship? Can dictators become human rights respecters or defenders? Thank you.
Anybody volunteering to answer that question?
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I would answer if that's, I think the short answer is no, and I agree that there needs to be a political transformation, and where does that come from? And I don't want, in my comments earlier, I didn't want to diminish at all the efforts of the European Parliament, of organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, I think that it's clearly is having an effect. But as Philip has said, as many as were released, twice as many have been rearrested. And I do think that the lack of statements from our government and other Western governments, not just about the COP27, but Sisi's been in power for nearly a decade now. The brutality of this dictatorship is unparalleled, certainly in Egypt, and probably elsewhere in the Middle East. So the silence, I think, from our governments, and I do have to say, yeah, I'm a journalist, and I do feel that, yes, Qatar has a lot to answer for, and we need to keep pressure on Qatar as journalists, and we certainly should highlight the fact that they have not gone nearly as far as they need to in terms of for example, the terrible treatment of migrants. It's better, yes, that's a plus, and we know the treatment of migrants elsewhere in the GCC states. However, I was looking for a much stronger statement coming from some establishment media, from commentators that would say, hang on a minute, you know, we have criticized Qatar, by and large fairly. Where's the criticism from our media? Sustained criticism about what's going on, and it's been going on for nearly a decade in Egypt in the run-up to COP27. And I feel very, and others have picked up, obviously, an environment. It's obvious, it's so clear, and yet, you know, I mean, our prime minister basically had to be embarrassed by his minister in order to even do one day at Sharm el-Sheikh. And as Peter Oborn was suggesting, will these people actually name the names? And the names are important. They are not just numbers, they're individuals. And shocking stories that are happening. Will our leaders go and say, excuse me, what about Allah? What about the family that you've talked? No, they won't do it because it's not the appropriate environment. And I'm saying, you know, as others have said, you can't separate the two. You know, human rights, environmental rights, absolutely entwined. And it's grotesque, I think, that this viciously repressive regime, which is doing enormous environmental damage by these huge mega projects that Sisi has embarked upon, should be hosting this event, and without any hard questioning, or any seriously hard questioning from our governments, from politicians, including opposition politicians, by the way, and also from our media. I would like to hear more than a trickle. Perhaps and again, I want to stress, I'm not at all of the European Parliament and of various NGOs which are, you know, doing extraordinarily important work.
Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, I think interesting question, do dictators, you know, become human rights champions? I think the answer is yes, but not voluntarily and not for long. And if you look around Africa and other parts of Southeast Asia, and you look at what happened after Bashir, you look what happened to Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe, you look what happened to the regime in Algeria, there might be an uprising, but it's all those countries have military control of the economy in some degree or other. But the key thing in Egypt is that after the uprising, when I was in Tahrir Square during at the end of the kind of uprising in 2011, and I was surprised at the sort of sophisticated resignation of some of the younger people there, saying we don't expect this to last very long because all the levers of power are not with us. And I think there was an additional problem, is that when Morsi was elected, the Western powers certainly were horrified at the prospect of Morsi or the Brotherhood being anywhere near power and this type of thing. So Sisi has ruthlessly taken advantage of the cover from this from the GCC countries and Saudi Arabia in particular, and from the Western countries. So he has mercilessly exploited the political cover that he has had internationally to, and he's focused not so much on his rather inefficient and you might say lazy military, but focused more on extending his tentacles economically as a way of keeping himself in power. But the difficulty for foreign interventions and economic involvement, when the British have the BP and so on, with the gas and the oil, the difficulty is the instability which is created by these processes and this extended level of control, because Egypt has become very, very, very unstable. Not only economically, it's extremely vulnerable economically, but it's also very, very unstable politically with the demographics. And a third of the population have contaminated water and all this type of thing. I mean, there's only a certain limit that people will accept. And so the country has become unstable, and those people who are investing in the country risk a lot. I mean, even the GCC countries, of course you don't know the terms of their investments and so on, but it's, when I say, it's the instability may lead to a change of government being more likely through economic collapse.
And let me just add to that. I think what we can say is that Egypt in the last decade has been characterized by a distinct lack of accountability, a circumvention of the rule of law, and a decimation of civil society. Now, even if there was a change in government tomorrow and all of the political prisoners were released tomorrow, if you do not implement a system of justice and accountability, the cycle of violence will continue. We've seen it in many parts of the world, that if you fail or you refuse to deal with a situation such as this, and if you fail to hold the perpetrators accountable, even if they are out of government and even if they are taken out of power, then Egypt will not truly return to a free democracy. And I think that this is one of the biggest problems. And we have to, we shouldn't be afraid to confront that and to confront that honestly. One of the things which is seriously lacking in Egypt is holding those perpetrators accountable from the top to the bottom. There has to be a system implemented. Now, I'm frequently asked, when is the time for that to start? And I think what we have to say is that it is a very difficult and it is a very long process. It's not something which is going to happen overnight, but we have to rely on our sense of justice and our sense that the truth will prevail. We've seen leaders the world over being held accountable, and I do truly believe that it will happen for Egypt one day. It's just not going to happen tomorrow. But this is the time, this is the forum to raise those concerns. Please.
Thank you all for all these important talks, and very informative, and thank you for sharing our concerns. Obviously British Egyptian, and we've been activists since the military coup. So my question is, obviously the whole world know that dictator Sisi is, violating the human rights. It's not a new information. I think everyone knows. And having Joe Biden now and Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson declaring that they are going to Egypt in this critical time during this COP27, and they know that he's greenwashing and everything, and they know about the human violations and all the prisoners, and Ala Abdel Fattah, the story has been in the news everywhere, and his sisters are, going through the streets of London. So do you think he's obviously the higher world, let's say, or the bigger world is supporting Sisi because they want him to be in place, And there is obviously strong forces behind them as well, like Israel and kind of, like they want them in the Middle East to protect their benefits and get the economy and the gas and petrol and all of that, because Egypt obviously is not a country that protects culture or climate or whatever, but they can use it to produce their power, which obviously the whole world wants the oil now after the war in Russia and Ukraine. So I'm not really pessimistic, but actually I'm pessimistic as well. Like, I don't think anything will change until we can change the concepts from the higher worlds. So thank you.
Thanks. So we've spoken a lot about the role of public entities, of state entities in their involvement in COP and involvement in this sort of greenwashing exercise. But one of the comments that stood out to me was that Egypt needs the world, and another comment that stood out was the fact that was the role of corporate entities or private entities at COP and in the, I suppose what you might say is the marketing of climate emergency and human rights in a way that's favourable to them. So with that in mind, what is the role of private entities, of corporations, or what should be the role of private entities of corporations at COP or in the climate emergency, linking with human rights, and how can we as consumers push them to fulfill that role?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm skeptical, I guess, as an activist and a campaigner that consistently campaigns are against these corporate entities that kind of plot themselves at these well-meaning conferences. I am skeptical as to what to expect from them. I think that's the honest question of actually, should we expect any good from these private entities that we know exist to serve themselves and to serve their stakeholders. And I do think that's a very important thing to acknowledge. And the reality is that like a lot of these CSR type projects that does occur, that does happen, often only happen to help and support their bottom, the balance sheet at the end of the day, right? And so my hope and my energy can never be with private entities in those spaces at all in any way. And I think where there is power and where there is an opportunity to displace power is with our nation states, right? Understanding that this is the 27th conference of the parties, and therefore the delegations that attend all around the world are country delegations. So every country sends a delegation, and therefore where we can displace power, where we can lobby, where we can make changes is within our own government policies and our own government delegations and the message that they send in those spaces. So I think that's really important to recognise. And there's a few different things happening. I know in the student space right now, there are young student activists that are mobilising with young climate activists that are going to be on the ground and planning on doing a whiteout on the 10th of November. So on the 10th of November, just, I don't know if you guys remember, but during the Black Lives Matter protest, there was a blackout. So, and there was a black square that was posted on social media. And people explained essentially the concepts behind police brutality and racism in the US and in the UK, and that kind of went viral. And actually that's something that some young activists in Egypt have taken on and are organising and mobilising with. So on the 10th of November, if you can all be a part of it too, but there will be a whiteout, and a whiteout essentially linking to the fact that political prisoners, more prisoners in Egypt were white, and that's the significance reason behind it, and there'll be a lot more on social media on that particular whiteout. But I do think there is power in us, in our ability to be able to mobilise and hold those entities accountable, and not expect that to come from essentially these private entities that are going to be controlling a lot of the narrative. I know we know from the last COP, there were more oil-based companies than there were people and civil societies of that space, and that was in Glasgow. So I expect it to be a lot worse and a lot more corporate in the upcoming COP that I'll be taking part in virtually. So yeah, I don't think the role should be placed with the private entities. I don't know if you want to link on from that, Philip.
Thanks, Samson. Maybe just, sorry, Toby. Yeah, just very quickly, because I think Samson mentioned the most important points. I was thinking about your question, and I was thinking, about what the conference is about, and clearly the conference is a conference of state parties. So in that sense, actually, the problem, and I think Samson said it, is actually the power, the undue power that corporate entities often had, and particularly then, fossil fuel companies and the like. And if we think about what needs to happen there, it's about states rebutting or rebuffing some of the lobbying that they will be subjected to, because at the end of the day, what we need is a rapid and equitable fossil fuel phase out. That needs to happen. We need wealthy states, as has been mentioned, to contribute seriously to climate finance, and we need as well to protect 1.5, protect the program that is intended to sort of mitigate the impact of climate change, global warming, to ensure a 1.5 degree warming and no more. So that's, in a way, it's about controlling the power that those companies, rather than, I think, what they can do. Of course, there's lots of things they can do, but it's not about what they can do at COP. That's what I would say.
Thank you. As we are drawing to... Oh, okay, we'll just take two more questions.
Thank you. Just very quickly, turning to the other major group of people that will be there, there's been like a slight tension in some of the things that have been said this evening in terms of the escalating arrests that we're seeing of anybody who speaks out against the regime versus rightly the say their names, speak up, speak out. What about the activists that will be going or might try to go, or we would hope should go, in terms of disengagement or engagement, and whether people feel that in going they're complicit in the greenwashing? I guess I'm kind of curious for a range of views here on what they should or shouldn't be doing. Is it better to go and not say anything, or is that worse to be there and not be speaking out? Zamzam, if you were thinking of going, what would your views be? Philip, in terms of the research that you've been doing, Amelia, as those of us who have lived there as non-Egyptians, how you feel in that environment about the ability to speak out.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take one last question, and then what I'm going to ask each of the panelists, if you'd just like to give your final remarks, and perhaps those that have been asked to respond, just respond briefly to that point.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank all the distinguished speakers in the panel, and I want to appreciate the decision of the King Charles that he decided not to participate in the event of the COP27 in Egypt. But I really wonder why there's no any criticisms in the House of Commons or any media, British media or UK media, about the decision which taken by the Prime Minister that he will participate in this kind of COP and go to Egypt, which is such a state, hate the green. They are working since they took over the power by the coup in 2013. They are working hard against the environment. They keep killing any trees, any green in the soil, and they keep build a lot of cement blocks everywhere. And plus, in addition, they are keep commence every day a lot of violences against the human rights. Everybody knows that, and I don't know why we never heard about anything written by the UK media or in the House of Commons. Just need to get the answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to now call on the panelists just to give their final remarks, starting with Amelia.
Yeah, so just to answer your question, do I think that activists should go to COP? I don't know. I'd like to say they should go and use it as a platform to speak out about human rights abuses, but we know that it's very dangerous to be a part of civil society in Egypt. I think what I'd like to see more of is the US or the UK leveraging what they have based on human rights. So, for example, several weeks ago, the British Investment Institute, which is backed by the British government, gave Egypt $100 million, I think, to invest in green tech or green startups. And I don't see any reason why this money should just be given to Egypt. I think it should be leveraged on, can we see tangible progress on human rights? So that's what I'd like to see more of in Egypt, and particularly around COP. And a lot of activists have asked world leaders and people who are attending to condition their attendance based on promise or, you know, seeing concrete steps towards human rights progress.
Thank you. Bill.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question about attendance, and I would say yes, people from outside who are activists who have the opportunity to go should go, and I think they should take whatever opportunity is presented in forums, in outside conversations, to push the point. And the point that I would like to see pushed is the absolute interconnectivity of human rights with environmental rights and the climate catastrophe that we all are, heading into. At the same time, it is, as Amelia said, it's extraordinarily dangerous, and we should not expect people, Egyptians, to make that same sort of statement. We have to do the fight on their behalf, because at the end of the day, yes, if I had been criticized, I'd be able to get in a plane and leave and come back to London. So I think we need to take that opportunity and drive it forward as quickly as possible. I accept what the gentleman has said about the grotesqueness of having this COP27 in a country which is so violently abusing not just its own people, but the environment. But there it is. It's happened, and I think that it would be incumbent upon those who have the opportunity, particularly from Western countries, to go and make a bit of a fuss. And also with these companies that Sam is talking about, absolutely, I agree. I mean, they use these opportunities, put some pressure on them. I heard an interview today with the chap who runs Iceland, the food shop, and he talked about compassionate conservatism. Compassionate, he's running as a conservative candidate, he hopes to be. Compassionate capitalism. Well, all right, call the bluff. That's what I would say, call the bluff. You call yourself a compassionate capitalist, you go to these big oil companies and say, no, we're really concerned about the issues of greening up. Call their bluff, challenge them, and take that opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, yeah, let me finish with trying to address those two points that have come up. One was on whether to go or not, and I guess Amnesty, when we were thinking about that question, our first port of call was to our Egyptian human rights organization colleagues, and we, we had a very frank conversation with them. Should we be going or should we not? And it was a reasonably resounding sort of response back that no, you've got to try and take this opportunity. There are very few like these, and there's very few of us. Of course, there are some who are able and willing to speak out in that type of hugely threatening environment, but we're in a very privileged position that, as Bill's saying, we can go, and we can at least speak to the media when we're there, so without the fear of sort of serious repercussions. So that was there was a pretty clear response that we heard and came away with and made plans accordingly. So, for instance, what was suggested and we've gone ahead with is asked to see Sisi, asked to see the Minister of Interior, asked to see the Minister of Foreign Affairs, asked to go to the new prisons that have been created to try to whitewash Egypt's human rights image. We won't be given access to those, but then but that will be then, of course, something that we'll be able to report to media if that, as I assume it will, doesn't happen. So that's at least been undertaken, and obviously, and the other element which was just as important was it was seen as something of a sort of solidarity, a moment of solidarity. Taken up. One other point I can come back to. The point was made that everyone knows about Egypt's sort of human rights record, and except, of course, that everyone here probably does because, for that reason you're here and interested in this talk, or in this panel discussion. But I don't think, clearly not everyone does, and I think then that's why this is an opportunity and why the fact that there is more media coverage is so important. And I just, point to one additional point here is that, Egypt has been spending a fortune on its on public relations to respond to criticism that's been increasing of its human rights record. One key element of that is its so-called National Human Rights Strategy, which was established last year, to much state media fanfare. Issued by a sort of rather grandiosely titled Supreme Standing Committee on Human Rights, a state body. And I guess one of the things that we've been trying to do as Amnesty is, and we had issued this very recently, is try to take that apart. So we put out a briefing called Disconnected from Reality, where we presented how deeply misleading that strategy is, because essentially it at times paints a completely false picture, and brazenly, in parts, puts the blame on challenges to the full enjoyment of Egyptians' human rights, on security threats, economic concerns at a global level, and the lack of awareness by Egyptian citizens of their legal rights. That's what you find in there. So I think, of course, it's not enough just trying to expose then that propaganda machine and what the reality is that lies behind it. But it is significant and is important, I think, at this particular time.
So a lot has been said, and as an Egyptian, I am very optimistic rather than pessimistic that there is growing awareness of what's happening in my country. Although the mobilization and the realization ought to be much greater, it is happening, although very slower than one would hope. I think the conference in Sharm el-Sheikh is an opportunity. Whether activists decide to go and NGOs decide to go, or some decide not to go for security reasons or as a protest, I think the issue remains the same. They can all still expose what's happening and call for justice and for the opening up of the civil space and respect for human rights. So whether you remain outside Sharm el-Sheikh or you decide to go, even with the threats that may accrue, even if you're non-Egyptian, it may still be somewhat uncomfortable. Your voices matter. I mean, we all know, of course, that those that wish to protest in Sharm el-Sheikh will be penned into a restricted area, that there is a cover-up that is constantly being promoted by the Egyptian regime, whether through, as was just mentioned, the human rights strategy, even the national dialogue, or anything else. It's all cosmetics. And if we see the release or the trickle of political prisoners come out, we all welcome it. We're all happy to see them reunited with their families. It is a joyful occasion for Egyptians to see this on their Facebooks or on social media. But at the same time, we know that others are being arrested almost simultaneously. And I think that's something we need to be fully aware of. I think something that I stressed or mentioned at the beginning with my opening remarks, and I think Joe Stork and others mentioned, is that we need to be extremely vigilant in the days ahead and weeks ahead, not just during COP, but after COP. Because if he will get the show that he wanted, Biden will be there and heads of state, and he will, everything will be televised and choreographed to the Egyptian public in the way that military regimes choreograph things so perfectly. But after that, the repression may well increase. And that's where international human rights organizations are so important to monitor what's happening. But I think my final point, and it's a kind of call, if you like, is to say that mobilization is key. International mobilization is key, because the Egyptians can't do very much at all. They haven't been able to do very much under the regime for 9 years. They have suffered, their numbers in prison have increased, their economic situation, as we've heard, has deteriorated and continues to deteriorate. There is a responsibility on us outside, Egyptians and non-Egyptians, to expose what's happening because of the importance of justice for a people that live under military dictatorship. Across civil society, whether it's to do with Egypt or any people living under dictatorship, is important. But let us be vigilant of what the dictator is going to do post Sharm el-Sheikh, and ensure also that we pressure our government here in the UK through parliamentarians and others to take action and be aware that the relationship with Egypt is a close bilateral one, but Egypt is getting away literally. The Egyptian regime is getting away literally with murder and torture. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. In the end, something has to be done. And I think the formulation, in order to get something done, you need a political and perhaps even an economic framework to deal with the problem as it is. And I think the formulation is the right formulation when we say, the audience and on the panel, when we say that in order to pursue climate justice and in order to pursue human rights, you need an environment where human rights are respected. You need a free, sufficiently free society with an active NGO sector and international engagement. And I think that's the right formulation. But those things, those factors, those things that you need are building blocks of democracy. So I think sometimes I rather shudder when one side blames socialism and state ownership and the other side blames capitalism. It's the building blocks of democracy and of freedom to protest and to monitor and have scrutiny of what governments and what private institutions and companies are doing. That's where the space exists to advance human rights and environmental justice. So I would reiterate the points that have been made by my colleagues on that particular point. And it's no more true, let's not forget, that the environmental damage being caused, it's not just carbon emissions in Egypt, it's water contamination, and let's not forget that in Roman times, Egypt was considered the breadbasket of Europe. It produced all the wheat for the Roman Empire, and there's no rainfall, so that the irrigation from the Nile is much worse, much less well managed than it was 2,000 years ago. So let us not forget that with a regime like this, and with military control, the situation declines. People still eat, of course, people still eat unleavened bread every day, but they don't make it themselves anymore, and it has to come from Russia and the Ukraine, and it's created all sorts of recent problems. Finally, it comes down to this: individual cases. I had somebody working with me doing translation and various other bits and bobs running around. I was in Nasiriyah in Iraq, who was a Coptic Christian. She was from Cairo. And she regularly in Cairo and Alexandria regularly protests about human rights violations, and especially the treatment of women and the legal position of women in Egypt. And she is regularly, she's not only beaten up, but I mean, and I was there at one time, outside the ministry, they strip her and her friends of clothes, and they're taken naked in vans to prison. And they're beaten up, and they're sometimes thrown out a week later, sometimes 2 weeks later. I mean, these individual cases, and all of us have experience of this, this is a brutality which the world needs to know more about. Not just, when I say the world, I also mean people like the British Prime Minister.
Thank you. Coming back to the question that was asked about attending COP. So I made the decision just actually 2 days ago to not attend COP in person. And that was for several reasons. I think the biggest reason, bearing in mind that some people even in this room messaged me with concerns about actually my safety and the ability to be able to actually protest or do any form of actual lobbying or even work in that space itself. And it was finally the words of my mother that made the final decision that I won't be going to COP. But I do think that there is still an element of and a power of being in that space. And even though Dr. Maha just mentioned that they've literally built a space to protest miles from conference. It is literally a cage. And therefore, it's not a protest. It's literally like willingly going to detention to be able to get in that space. And so there'll be no ability to do any forms of actions. There's mass levels of surveillance. So even bringing clothes that are like have messaging on them will probably be taken off you on levels of security. There is just all kinds of levels of security, like was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers, that the Egyptian government has commissioned 500 taxis to pick up any guests that are arriving to the conference, and all of those taxis are surveillanced and will be monitored. All of the conference spaces that you'll be staying at will be monitored, surveillanced. You can't even download the COP app and navigate to where you're going to be going to without giving your name, giving your passport, and enabling your location server to be followed at all times. So, and also there was a report that it also gives access to your camera and your microphone. So the reality is, we know that this COP will be heavily surveillanced, which means that a lot of people will be moving in very cryptic spaces and trying to organize, but also a lot of people will be worried, rightfully so, for their safety or the safety of the people who are on the ground that they're organizing with. And also another thing to recognize is that so the way in which COP usually sets up is that there's two spaces in COP. So there's a green zone and there's a blue zone. The blue zone is the delegations, there's a required to get accreditation to do that, but the green zone is actually open to the general public. It's a space where the public, the community of that country, come together and organize, talk about what's happening within their space. It's a space where civil societies, organize and have all kinds of conversations about different things. That's not going to work the same way in this very conference. So actually, I think there's an importance of recognizing that this COP itself is being utilized in probably what is a very smart PR stunt, if you think about it, in the sense that it's using itself as the voice of the global south. It's using itself as the voice of the countries most impacted by the climate crisis. And therefore, if you think about a country, in the global south, who's like Nigeria, for example, the mass floods that they had this summer, right? Understanding that actually they need climate financing, and that's an urgency for them, right? And Egypt stepping up as this country that's going to lead and be a voice of reason. I think there's there needs to be very transparent conversations had, that the reality is Egypt doesn't care about the impacts that's happening in Nigeria, nor does it care about the droughts happening in Somalia. But it's actually just a very well-polished PR stunt that needs to be unpolished by activists and environmentalists, especially in these spaces. But I think we can't let it down to the environmentalists. The reality is that the IPCC, for the first time in February, mentioned colonialism as a link to the impacts of the climate crisis, and environmentalists applauded and danced as if there was a victory. And I think that lets you know actually that we're busy celebrating crumbs and not actually recognizing that we need to fight for social justice at its very root. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think everything that could be said has been said, so I won't add further to that. Will you all just join me in thanking our amazing panel for their insights tonight? I'd also like to thank the staff and the volunteers this evening for making it all possible, so if we could give those a round of applause as well. And let me thank all of you for attending, without whom none of this would have been possible. I know some of you have travelled from outside of London to attend, and we greatly appreciate your attendance as well. We will, of course, be following Egypt. We will, of course, be holding future events on Egypt and other situations. The recording of this event will remain on Guernica 37's Facebook page. We will also be posting details of future events on the Guernica 37 website, so please do follow that for details of further events. I can say it has been an absolute privilege and an honour to chair this event, and once again, thank you all very much for coming.
Sure.
Yeah.
One group photo is okay in the panel?
Yep.